Are you familiar with the strategy of the transnational criminal organizations that are flooding migrants across the border, overwhelming Border Patrol and other law enforcement authorities so that then the drug traffickers can move illicit drugs across the border? Are you familiar with that, what I would call a business model?
I am, and I set up specifically directed the establishment of a task force on anti-smuggling and anti-human trafficking for just the reason you said. It involves our Civil Rights Division, our Criminal Division, and the U.S. Attorney's offices all along the border, as well as our offices in the Northern Triangle countries and Mexico.
I think you and I had this conversation earlier, maybe at your confirmation hearing, but I think the Attorney General has the toughest job in government, I believe, because you have to wear two hats. You are the chief law enforcement officer of the country, and you are also a political appointee and a member of President Biden's cabinet. But I think you also told us at the hearing, your confirmation hearing, you repeatedly said that the executive branch cannot simply decide based on policy disagreements that it will not enforce the law. Is that still your position?
Yes, it is, Senator.
On September the 11th, 2001, we lost about 3,000 Americans to a terrorist attack. We declared a war on terror. The Congress issued an authorization for the use of military force. If you took the size of an average 737 or a passenger jet today, holds between 145 and 185 passengers, if you were to rack up all of the deaths that we've seen as a result of drugs coming across the southwestern border, as a result of this successful business model that the cartels have employed, you would be talking about the equivalent of a passenger jet per day crashing, killing everyone on board. I have been just astonished at the lack of sense of urgency to deal with this issue. It seems we become so desensitized to it that that sense of urgency is simply gone. But I will tell you that it's directly related to the open border policies of the Biden administration, where people continue to come across the border, turn themselves into a broken asylum system, or simply get away from law enforcement because they're overwhelming the Border Patrol's capacity. This is intentional, as you acknowledged. It's a business model of the cartels, and they are getting rich, and students like those parents who I met with last week in Johnson High School in Hays County, Texas, right outside of Austin, are losing their sons and daughters to fentanyl overdoses because of exactly this successful business model by the cartels. I want to ask you a little bit about the prosecution policies of the Garland Attorney General's Department of Justice. Sort of the bedrock standard for prosecuting crimes has historically been that the prosecutor should pursue the most serious, readily provable offense, and that's been the bedrock of policy for over decades. We know that Eric Holder, when he was Attorney General, changed that standard, and specifically what I want to ask you is about two different memos that you've issued to prosecutors with regard to mandatory minimum sentencing. And specifically, in the charging memo, one of the charging memos, you said the proliferation of provisions carrying mandatory minimum sentences has often caused unwarranted disproportionality in sentencing and disproportionately severe sentences. Now, just to be clear, mandatory minimum sentences are statutory, correct? In other words, they're passed by Congress and signed into law by the president.
Yes, that's right.
And here, you suggest that prosecutors should not enforce or charge defendants with a crime which carries a mandatory minimum under certain circumstances, correct?
I did not, it's not exactly, if I can just have a moment to explain. I'm very
No,
familiar.
well, if you just answer the question. So the memo says specifically, I'll just read it to you. It said, for this reason, charges that subject a defendant to a mandatory minimum sentence should ordinarily be reserved for instances in which the remaining charges would not sufficiently reflect the seriousness of the defendant's criminal conduct, danger to the community, harm to victims, or other considerations outlined above. So basically, your charging memorandum says that prosecutors can exercise their discretion to charge less than the most serious offense because you don't like the mandatory minimum sentences that Congress has passed, correct?
No, Senator. This is a question of allocating our resources and focusing them on violent crime. Later on,
I thought you said that your job was to enforce the law without regard to policy differences.
it's not a question of policy differences. It's a question of the resources.
You don't have enough money. You don't have enough people.
We don't have enough money. We don't have enough jails. We don't have enough judges.
Well, you've arrogated to yourself the decision to make policy by saying that in spite of the fact that there are mandatory minimum sentences for many of these drug crimes, which are now causing untold death and destruction across America, you're telling prosecutors don't charge those if they involve a mandatory minimum sentence.
With respect, Senator, the memorandum makes clear that that general analysis doesn't apply in violent crime, doesn't apply in drug trafficking, doesn't apply in cases in which there's injury.
So you're cherry picking which cases that you will charge with a mandatory minimum sentence and not applying them uniformly and charging the most serious crime that can be proven at
If we
trial.
apply it to every single crime, we will not be able to focus our resources on violent crime and significant drug trafficking, on the cartels, on the people who are killing people with fentanyl. So the purpose here is to focus the attention of our prosecutors and agents on the things that are damaging the American people in the largest possible respect. That's what what this policy says.
At 108,000 roughly Americans who died as a result of drug overdoses last year, 71,000 roughly of fentanyl overdoses, do you consider your current policies successful?
As I said in answer to another question, we have a huge epidemic of fentanyl problem created by intentional acts by the cartels. We are doing everything we can within our resources to fight that. We have our DEA working to prevent transfer of precursors into Mexico, to capture the labs, to extradite the cartel leaders, to arrest them in the United States. We are focusing on fentanyl with enormous urgency. I have personally twice traveled to Mexico to try to get greater cooperation from the Mexicans on exactly the problem you're talking about. I have separately talked twice in person with the Mexican Attorney General for exactly the problem that you're talking about. We are focusing on this with enormous urgency. This is a priority of the Justice Department, but this is a whole of government problem. The border is a responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security. We do what we can do with respect to the jurisdictions that we have.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Senator Blumenthal.